Hi you guys, and welcome back to another one of my videos. If you're new here, my name is Holly and thank you so much for watching. You guys, I want to know what you think of my hair. I feel like I'm giving myself the vibes of, oh, do you know that girl in Spy Kids 2? I'm gonna insert a photo of her. I kind of feel like I look like that, but I also kind of love it. So let me know what you think. Also, my earrings are from my friend's little business called the Aurora Collective, which I will link below if you want to get any cute little earrings like these ones. I really like them. But without further ado, let's get into it. I wanted to quickly make a disclaimer that this video will include images, and I will be talking about an Aboriginal person who has passed away. And so if that is something that you are sensitive to, I have a lot of other videos which don't include Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, so you're more than welcome to watch those ones, but I just wanted to put that disclaimer at the beginning of this video. So today I wanted to talk to you about a case which involves a boy who went by the name Mark Haines. Mark grew up in Tamworth and he was an Aboriginal boy from the Gomeroi tribe, which is a tribe that originates from around Tamworth area. There's a lot of people from that tribe that live around there even to this day. Mark was described by family and friends as very popular, very smart. He was really athletic. He was pretty good at cricket and also basketball. He was just a happy-go-lucky person that was always smiling and was someone that just really enjoyed life. He seemed like the sort of person that you would always want to be at your parties, always want to be hanging out with, because he was just a good time. His family said he had no enemies. He was just a peaceful person. He was that person that you see that you're like, yes, I want to be friends with them. They seem like fun. A couple of his friends nicknamed him Stony because he had a low, slow drawl when he talked. It's kind of can be compared to that of John Wayne. And he was quite soft-spoken too. Mark grew up with a couple of siblings that it seems like he got along with quite well. And by the time he was 17, he also had a girlfriend who went by the name Tanya White. And she was actually a white person too, which at the time it was less common for mixed race relationships to be a thing. But from the research I did, it seemed like his family liked her. She seemed like just a friendly, chilled out sort of person, so they were happy that Mark was happy. One night, Tanya, Mark and a whole bunch of other people, a group of friends, went to a nightclub in Tamworth, which was known as Domino's nightclub. Now this nightclub has no relation to the pizza place, but as a side note, I feel like Domino's should definitely start a nightclub, because I can't think of anything better than having a pizza and some garlic bread when I'm like dancing on the dance floor. And maybe a thick shake too, guys. Also a side note, but Domino's does the best thick shakes. If you guys have a Domino's near you, give it a go. But anyways, I digress. So Mark and his friends had gone to this nightclub, and at the time Mark was actually only 17, so he had got a fake ID of his sister's friend so he could get into the nightclub on this night, which was the 15th of January. Now back then it was a lot easier to get fake IDs because you didn't even need like a photo of yourself. You literally just needed like a birth certificate which had your name and your date of birth on it. So yeah, a lot easier to get a fake ID back then. But on that night, the group of friends spent a bit of time there. They were drinking and smoking. It wasn't a night that was anything out of the ordinary. I mean, it was a Friday night in 1988, so a lot of kids would go out on a Friday night for something to do. Just after midnight, Mark and Tanya left with another couple. They made their way to East Tamworth, which is where Tanya lived, and she said later on in the coronial inquest that it was about 3:30 by the time that she said goodbye to Mark. But she said goodbye and she saw him jog back up the street in the rain, because it was a bit of a rainy night that night. The next morning it was still raining, and news all over Tamworth would break that a young 17-year-old boy was found dead on the train tracks. This man was Mark Haines, and he had appeared to be sleeping on the train tracks around the time of the incident, which was at 6 AM. according to the freight train driver. The freight train driver initially, when he thought he'd hit the body. He was too scared to get out of the train to see, or you know, like look at what had happened, which I can completely understand. So he got in contact with a man by the name of Glenn Bryan, who at the time was the Tamworth assistant station manager. So Glenn went to the scene to see if there was any chance that the victim was still alive. And as a side note, this wasn't actually the first body that Glenn had seen on the train tracks, and I just thought that was so sad. You know, as a train driver, having to go through that, because it isn't necessarily uncommon for people to end their lives on train tracks. And yeah, I just can't even imagine how much trauma train drivers would go through if they're the ones driving the train when that happens. But Glenn was the first person to see the body, and he noticed straight away that this head wound that Mark had on his head was not consistent with what wounds would look like if you were hit by a train. The head injury that Glenn describes was a massive head wound on Mark's head, and it almost looked like a crushed eggshell type head wound. And working with trains for quite some time, Glenn was well aware that if you were to be hit by a train, it would, quote, make a mess of you. And Mark was still intact, you know, like his body was still all there. And a lot of the time, or most of the time, when people are hit by trains, it is just a real mess. When Glenn looked at Mark, he saw that there was no tissue, no bodily matter, no hair scattered anywhere, and there was not near enough blood to warrant the train being the reason for Mark's death. Also, Mark had been found in the middle part of the train tracks, so he hadn't even really been hit by the train. His body was placed, you know, like in between where the metal parts of the train track are. So he basically was in a gap in between where the train would be, because if you think about a train, it's gonna look sort of like this, like the bottom of the train and then where it connects to the train tracks, and Mark was like here lying down. He wasn't bleeding a lot either. He only had about the size of a 50-cent coin amount of blood on him, and again, like I said, if you're hit by a train, the amount of blood that's going to be there at the scene is a lot more. So to Glenn, straight away, nothing was really adding up. Mark's jeans were torn and he had a gash on his thigh, but again, there was not much blood. Glenn then noticed there was a towel under Mark's head, which was folded in half and then in half again, almost as if someone had put it there, which he thought was really strange. From the get-go, things weren't adding up for Glenn. He believed that Mark had been put there in an attempt to make it look like he'd committed suicide, but Glenn theorized he had already passed away when he'd been put there. But of course, Glenn wasn't a professional, so he called the police to get backup. Now, I truly believe if Mark had been a white boy, this investigation would have gone a lot differently. I believe that because he was an Aboriginal boy, the police barely even investigated. They did not treat this case as suspicious whatsoever. The following day, the police knocked on the Haines' door to let the family know of what they had found. Mark's mum and sister, Lorna, were there at the time, and understandably, they were both absolutely distraught at the news that their beloved son and brother had passed away. Mark's uncles went to the place on the tracks where Mark had been found because they just wanted to get an idea of what had happened on that night, because they just couldn't believe the police's theory that Mark had just walked onto the tracks and lay down to commit suicide. They knew Mark, they knew who he was, and they knew that he wouldn't be the type of person to do this. And when Mark's uncles reached the railway tracks, they said that they were stunned. Mark's uncle Craig said that he remembers that when he saw the tracks, there was no evidence that Mark's body had been there the night before. Normally nowadays, what police will do is they will mark the spot where a body is found because it's, you know, it's evidence. They want to be able to go back to that spot, know exactly where it is, and be able to look at it and see if there's any evidence around the area, anything like that. And there was just nothing. Police had literally picked up the body, moved it, and gone on with their lives. But Mark's family didn't want to believe believe that the police had been so nonchalant about the death of their loved one. So for a couple weeks they just left it, and they were hoping that the police were working on the case. A few weeks passed and they had heard nothing from the police, or they had heard barely anything from the police, I should say. They felt like police were doing not nearly enough in this case, and so they decided to go back to the railway tracks and see if they could find any evidence to help the case. Essentially, they were going to go back there and do the police's job for them. And that's what they did. They went out there and they found the remains of a cardboard box. They found wrapping paper. They found a black comb, and they found a pink lighter. And Mark's girlfriend Tanya had actually said that there was a high chance Mark had had that comb with him, but the lighter, the pink lighter, was definitely not his. And so look, I don't know about you, but I feel like if there is a piece of evidence found really close to a body of someone who has died under suspicious circumstances, you want to be investigating that piece of evidence, especially if you have beliefs that it wasn't his, because if it wasn't his, then whose was it? You know, that person has some explaining to do as to why their lighter is so close to where a body was found. And you guys, this bit makes me pretty mad. So Mark's family, they collected all that evidence, they took it to the police, and the police's response was, oh, we thought we put this in evidence bags already. Sorry. I don't know about you guys, but I could not even imagine how mad Mark's family would have been at that response. Like, seriously, you were dealing with a suspicious death and you accidentally forgot to put some evidence in an evidence bag. And mind you, it had been 2 weeks by this point, so the evidence you're gonna find on an item the day after compared to like 2 weeks after is a lot less. So the case, even from that, was jeopardized. The day after Mark was found, the train crew also notified the police that a car had turned up on the train tracks that same night. The car was really damaged, and the car was a manual Tirana. Although police had this information, they did not investigate any further at that time. So a few weeks later, the family went to that Tirana because they wanted to have a look for themselves. It appeared that the police had not opened the boot to this car at all, and the car wasn't locked or anything like that either. In the boot, when they opened it, they actually found a tire and a car mat that appeared to have what looked like blood stains on it. But the car had been left in the elements with no fingerprinting being taken on it, as the police said it would have been too wet to get any fingerprints anyway. But get this, you guys, the police then go on to tell Mark's family that they think he must have stolen that car. So at this point, the police are looking kind of fishy, or should I say the police are looking blatantly racist. Like, why would they turn around and say that Mark stole that car after having no interest in it? It seems like they're just trying to make up a story that fits their theory. There is a reason Mark's family do not believe he stole that car, and it is because Mark couldn't actually drive manual. All of his family and friends knew this. Manual cars are actually really hard to drive if you don't know how, and I have a hard time believing that Mark would have been able to drive around town without anyone realizing something suspicious was happening, because you would literally be like bunny hopping your whole way around town, and that in itself would bring attention to you. So the fact that that night no one had reported seeing anything like that, it just kind of makes the police's story look suspicious. Police, I think your story's not adding up. I think you have some explaining to do. Another thing that didn't add up was the fact that when Mark was found, his shoes were pretty much clean. Because as I had mentioned before, this night was a really wet, rainy, muddy one. And for Mark to get to where he was found on the tracks from the car, as police had theorized, he had to walk across this little train bridge. I'll insert a photo of it here. But basically, the only way he could have gotten from where he was on that night to where he was found was if he had walked only on the metal parts of the train tracks. That's the only way his shoes could have stayed as clean as they did if the police's theory is true. So as I'm sure you can imagine, Mark's family didn't believe this for a second. His uncles went back to the site and retraced the route from the car to where Mark's body was found. They tried to walk on the little bit of metal all the way there, and they found it impossible. And mind you, they were doing it on a nice, sunny, dry day, whereas Mark was doing it at night, on a rainy night, when he was intoxicated. And if Mark's uncles couldn't even do it in the day, how the heck could have Mark done it at night? The explanation from police for Mark's death has been seen as less than satisfactory, and it has been scrutinized for being racially biased, with David Shoebridge, an Aboriginal justice spokesperson, stating that there is no conceivable way that if this was a white person, the investigation would have ended in a dead end the way it did. I mean, police were making it pretty clear that they didn't care. Mark's uncle Jack has stated that the police just didn't want to do the paperwork. He was a young Aboriginal boy, and that was it. He was just out for a joyride, and that's the end of that. A few months after Mark was laid to rest, Mark's uncles actually hear a rumour that Mark was killed because he was planning to steal some marijuana crops with a group of different people. The police actually took statements from the teens who had started this rumour, but Mark's family said that Mark had never been in trouble with the law in his life and only smoked marijuana occasionally, like a lot of other 17-year-olds. But an anonymous former drug dealer did tell reporters that the drug trade in Tamworth at the time was absolutely massive. And if there was plans for marijuana to be stolen, then the outcome of that would be death. Which I can believe. I mean, people that are involved in drugs aren't normally second chance type people, but I guess it's whether we believe that Mark was that involved in drugs or not. I mean, Mark's friends and family do not believe that Mark was involved in the drug trade. They just don't believe that he would have got caught up in something like that. But the person who was the suspected killer, if this theory was true, was a young and upcoming boxer who also lived in Tamworth, who went by the name Eddie Davis. It was theorized that Eddie was part of the drug ring and he was the one that took out Mark. It was theorized that he was doing the dirty work for someone higher up in the drug world, but like I said, these are just theories. But Mark's uncles at this time were still conducting their DIY investigation, and when this theory came out around the same time, they happened to come across Eddie walking down a street one day. They pulled up beside him and asked him if he wanted a lift home, and I'm guessing that Eddie mustn't have known who they were because he got in the car happily with them. Eddie said that they drove off in the car into open country paddocks, and then the uncles stopped the car and immediately started questioning him. They asked him if he killed Mark, and Eddie said he was quite taken aback. He said he then saw one of the men get out of the car with what he thought was a baseball bat, but it was actually this Aboriginal stick. It's called a bundi stick. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'll include a photo of it here too. But when Eddie saw this stick, he took this opportunity to get out of the car and run. He wasn't sticking around, that's for sure. Eddie says that the idea of Mark being taught a lesson for stealing drugs is beyond belief, and he is absolutely devastated for being associated with the death of Mark. So what did happen to Mark Haines? His case actually went cold for over 20 years until a journalist by the name of Alan Clark started investigating it. By this point, because it had been so long, some of the evidence had been lost, like the towel that was under Mark's head the night that he was found. But some new evidence came out. So remember that car that they had found the night of Mark's death that they never bothered to fingerprint? Well, 25 years later, it had come out that the car had a connection to one of Mark's friends, Terry. A relative of Terry's had chosen to come forward. He wanted to remain anonymous, but he said at the time of the incident, he was 14. He said that that night, Terry had come into his room and told him that he needed to get up because Terry had something that he wanted him to come along to. The anonymous person said that Terry took him to the tracks and it was really dark. He couldn't see very well at all, but he could make out that there was a body on the tracks. But this is all that this anonymous person was willing to say at the time. Now, you might wonder why Terry hasn't said anything on the matter, and it is because, unfortunately, Terry actually committed suicide 6 months after Mark was found. In 2018, the case was actually moved to the New South Wales State Homicide Squad, as it was apparent that the Oxley Local Area Command wasn't really doing that much with the case. And this switch gave Mark's family a little bit of hope that there might be some new leads in the case. His family, I'm pretty sure it was his uncle, actually put a $20,000 reward out for anyone who could bring any information that would help the case be resolved. A little while later, the Oxley police also put some money towards any information on this case being found. They put $500,000, which is actually quite a lot of money. I don't know, maybe they felt a bit guilty about how poor of an effort they did on the whole rest of the case. But the same day that the Oxley police put this money forward was actually the day that Mark's body was put to rest. But some good came from these rewards being put out. The anonymous person that said they were with Terry that night came forwards. It was actually Terry's younger brother, Mick. And he decided to meet up with Alan Clark, that journalist, to talk a little bit more about what had happened that night. I listened to the audio of this meeting because it's on a podcast on Spotify, which I will link below too, by the way. And this Mick guy sounds a little bit strange. I don't know, he sort of came forward and he was like, "Hi, I'm Mick. I'm also known as Mick the Poet," and he sort of just started reading like some poetry. So I was kind of like, is this guy just coming forward to promo his poetry? But he did say this. He said when he went with Terry to go to the body, he remembered Terry comforting the body. He also said he and his brother never discussed the incident after that night. But Terry and Mick, or Mick the Poet I should say, their mum came forward and said that they actually believed that Terry's car might have had something to do with that night. Basically, they said that that car, Terry's car, might have been the second car driving people around that night, and also that car went missing that exact night. And I don't know like why she didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she did, but police didn't look into it. But I don't know, I feel like if my son came home and was like, "Oh, by the way, like, lost my car," I'd be like, "Well, you're gonna go find your car because that's a whole car." But anyways, I'm not Terry's mum, so I don't know what happened that night. But Tanya was actually also tracked down. I don't know if you guys remember me mentioning Tanya, but she was the girlfriend of Mark. She didn't want to say anything. She did not want to speak on the case whatsoever. Jason Wan, though, who was Mark's best friend at the time, did decide to speak out. And this part is a bit confusing, but basically Jason came forwards to say that a woman that he really trusted, who's anonymous, had said that another person had gotten really drunk one night and told her that he had been there the night that Mark died. And we're gonna call this anonymous man Greg. So apparently when Greg was really drunk, he said he had been there that night. He said he put a box over the body of Mark, and that's basically all he said on the matter. Now, Jason said that he had called Crime Stoppers to report this when he found out about this, but when Crime Stoppers was contacted, there was no record of this phone call. I don't know how long ago the phone call had happened, and I don't know how long Crime Stoppers keeps information, but yeah, I just thought I would add that in. Now, Greg was actually also tracked down and agreed to do an interview, but in the interview he denied anything. He said he was at the club with Mark that night of Mark's death, but he said he remembers nothing else. In his statement to police that he wrote up at the time of Mark's death, he said he had an alibi, someone he went home with, but police never investigated this alibi. But let's talk about theories. So I guess the biggest one is that night there was reportedly a whole bunch of of teenagers hooning around Tamworth. And as I mentioned, that night was a really wet one, so it's theorized that Mark potentially got into a car crash where he was really severely hurt, and maybe the other people freaked out and put him on the tracks to make it look like a suicide. This would potentially explain Terry's actions. Maybe he knew what had happened to Mark and couldn't deal with the guilt, which is why he committed suicide, but it's just a theory. I don't know for sure. To support this theory though, Dr. John Duflau, a forensic pathologist, pointed out that Mark had suffered from a subdural hematoma, and this sort of injury is often caused either by physical assault or by someone being in a severe car crash. You can't get an injury like this within seconds and die within seconds, so it is theorized that Mark did survive for a period of time. Dr. Duflau also says that Mark has to have been bleeding quite substantially, because when looking at his organs, they were really pale, and this only happens when you have lost a severe amount of blood, which doesn't line up with the theory that Mark sustained those injuries at the train tracks where he was, because like I said, he didn't have a lot of blood near him. So I guess the only reasonable explanation is that he sustained the injury somewhere else. The police's theory is still that after the car was rolled, Mark was able to walk that kilometre to where he lay down on the train tracks, but Dr. Duflau was also able to debunk this, saying that with a head injury like the one he had, there is very little chance that he could have been walking anywhere. He must have gotten there some other way. But you guys, this brings me to the end of the case. I feel really sad with this one because I really feel like there is no closure. I really feel for Mark's family, because if I, who didn't know him, feels that way, I can only imagine how his family feels, not knowing what happened to him and who was involved on that night. I definitely think this case is the one that has touched me the most while researching it. But you guys, I hope you learned something from this. Please give this video a like if you liked it, and also subscribe if you want to. I really appreciate the support, and I will be leaving a link to Crime Stoppers down below, and if anyone has any information on the case, please don't hesitate to contact them. And I will also be leaving links to a few websites that just are able to show you the injustices that Aboriginals go through statistics. That's a really hard word to say, but I hope you know what I mean. Statistics. There we go, got it. You guys, the racial divide is still prevalent today, and I hope that by sharing this I can show you guys that, and I don't know, just help us all work towards a less racist world. But yeah, like I said, all the relevant links will be down below, and I hope that I will see you in my next video. Bye you guys.